Hey, Mom, bring me a beer.
Huh? Mother-in-law, did you lose your hearing all of a sudden?
You can hear me, right? Hey, I told you to bring me a beer.
This is how it always goes when my son and his wife speak to me. We've been living together for 5 years, and they've never listened to me, always ignoring what I have to say. When they do speak to me, it's always just orders, like I'm some sort of maid. Jean, my daughter-in-law, speaks ill of me for everyone to hear, and Paul, my son, treats me like a housekeeper without a second thought. Ignoring them, I turn my back and pretend to watch the TV, acting as if I can't hear them. I'm at the end of my tether with these two, who only listen when they want something, but ignore me otherwise. After a while of ignoring them, Jean picks up the TV remote and shuts off the show I was watching. Startled, I looked up when she said loudly right into my ear, "Hey, mother-in-law, can you hear me? Make sure you prepare Paul's lunch tomorrow, got it?" Her voice was so loud that it made my ears ring and I involuntarily grimaced. Seeing this, my daughter-in-law laughed, saying, "Seems like you heard it," and left the living room with my son. Wouldn't she at least try to be a bit more considerate, since I am, after all, her husband's mother, and she relies on me on a daily basis? That's what I thought. But judging from my son's attitude, I'm probably nothing more than a housemaid in her eyes. In the end, there was no apology from the two of them, nor did I feel any consideration towards me. Feeling frustrated, I sent an email to my husband and decided to leave the house. My name is Karen. I will be turning 72 this year. 5 years ago, my son and his wife asked if they could live with me, because they were worried about the future and wanted to save money. Ever since then, we have been living together as two families under one roof.
If you live with us, you'll feel safer, right, Mom?
You might be right. My husband is a workaholic who started his own company when he was young and continues to work tirelessly, even at the age of 73. Because of his nature, the house felt quiet ever since our son moved out. Even when I consulted my husband about our son and his wife moving in with us, his only response was,
"Do whatever you like."
So as there wasn't much conversation and I felt a bit bored, I agreed to live together, hoping that life would become a bit more lively. When we started living together, Jean, my son's wife, and I split our housework. However, as she started saying, "My part-time job is getting busier," the workload for me gradually increased. Although she helps out when asked, she often does so reluctantly, goes out on her days off, or lazes around in her room, so I stopped asking for her help. I ended up taking on all the household tasks, and it became the norm, making me feel unappreciated. Even during meal times when the whole family is present, there is hardly any conversation. I suppose I've been numb to this, as it was the same way with my husband. One day, while I was preparing dinner for 3 as usual, I received a message from my husband saying,
"I'll be late for work. Don't eat dinner."
This was not unusual, but the problem was with my son and his wife.
"Dad's coming home late, huh? I don't eat dinner either."
"Oh, I'm going out with a friend, so I don't need it either." "Why are you telling me this now? I've already made it," I exclaimed.
"It's fine, just leave it for tomorrow."
Despite it being dinner time, if I didn't say anything, they were about to go without a word. They could have told me if I didn't need to prepare them dinner in the first place. As long as they weren't inconvenienced, they would never even reach out to me first. I couldn't help but complain at their rudeness, but they left without a hint of remorse. What am I working so hard for? In the quiet living room, I was staring blankly at the dinner I had already prepared, which would now go to waste. What on earth am I doing? Thinking about it made me feel utterly exhausted. I covered the still warm dinner with plastic wrap, put it in the fridge, and decided to go to bed. The next morning when I came down to the living room, my husband, who had woken up earlier, apologized, saying, "I'm sorry." As usual, our exchange was brief. It should have ended there, but seeing the look on my face, my husband furrowed his brows slightly and asked,
Didn't Paul and his wife eat dinner?
Huh? No, they said they didn't eat dinner and went out.
I see.
I guess he saw the dinner for 3 in the fridge and asked. I was happy to have a conversation after a long time, so I told my husband about what happened last night. My reticent husband sat quietly, listening to me. After hearing me out, he gently said,
You don't have to push yourself.
He acknowledged,
Our son's attitude is getting worse day by day.
But if I don't take care of the house, nobody will, right?
That doesn't mean you have to overdo it.
His words felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. I realized that I had been pushing myself, and was happy that my husband understood this. My son and his wife aren't small children anymore, so there was no need for me to work so hard. With that thought, my view of the situation seemed to brighten.
I might be late from work again, so you don't need to prepare dinner for me tonight.
Okay, I said, smiling at my husband's words. I decided to let my son and his wife understand this as well. Despite it being a Sunday, I waved goodbye to my husband and resolved to rebel against my son and his wife. After my husband left, my son and his wife finally woke up in the afternoon. Still in their pajamas, they came into the living room and immediately asked,
What's for lunch?
Why don't you eat what's left from yesterday?
But you could at least warm it up for us, or set it on the table.
You're not small children, you can do it yourself. Well, mother-in-law, you are getting old, aren't you? Jean, my daughter-in-law, joked with a laugh, which prompted, Oh, has mother-in-law suddenly gone deaf?
You can hear us, right? We're asking for beer.
Paul demanded, while Jean kept on making snide remarks, and Paul talked to me like I was their housemaid. Ignoring them, I turned my back and deliberately watched TV, pretending not to hear. When I didn't respond for a while, she seemed to give up and stop talking to me. But this peace was short-lived. Before I knew it, my daughter-in-law, who had come up behind me, picked up the TV remote and turned off the TV. Startled, I looked up, only for her to shout into my ear. Hey, mother-in-law, can you hear me? Make sure to prepare lunch for Paul tomorrow, okay? Her voice was so loud that it hurt my ears, making me wince involuntarily. Looking at me, my daughter-in-law laughed, saying, Looks like she heard me, and left the living room with Paul. I wondered why she didn't consider showing a bit of courtesy, given that I'm her husband's mother, and she depends on me regularly. But observing Paul's attitude, it seemed like I was nothing more than a housemaid to her. As it turned out, there was no sign of consideration for me at all, and I didn't even hear an apology for last night's dinner from either of them. Sighing deeply, I sent a text to my husband and decided to leave the house. Early next morning, I packed my belongings and left the house before they woke up. When I arrived at a nearby business hotel, my phone was filled with texts from Paul, who seemed to have just woken up before heading to work. Apparently, they were in quite a chaos this morning. Texts and calls from both of them quickly filled my phone with notifications. When I opened the text, I saw nothing but complaints, such as,
What are you doing? I told you I'll need lunch.
Jean also sent a text in a mocking tone. Are you wandering around after forgetting your responsibilities? It seemed they had a hard time just because I didn't prepare breakfast for them, which made me laugh a little. When I saw a call from Paul, who seemed to be on his lunch break, I decided to finally talk to him.
You finally picked up. Mom, where the hell are you, and what are you doing?
It's none of your business, is it?
You didn't even prepare our food. Where are you?
Paul, you're not a child. You can make your own food, can't you? I answered him with a mix of irritation. If he had struggled so much to prepare just one meal, he should have reflected a little and thanked me. But to my surprise, he came back with a word I never expected.
I'm paying for living expenses, so I need you to do the housework.
Living expenses? What are you talking about? I never received such a thing.
Huh? Why not? Jean should have been giving it to you every month, so don't lie.
Paul insisted that he was paying me living expenses. I've never received anything of the sort. And when I truthfully denied it, Paul started calling me a liar. The truth is, my husband covers all of their living expenses, including their food expenses. Even after repeatedly saying this, Paul refused to believe me. I could hear Jean in the background saying, "You're probably just playing dumb and spending it for yourself." Unable to continue the conversation, I cut them off and said, "I don't know what I don't know, and I don't plan to come home for a while."
Why not? What are we supposed to do for food?
Figure it out yourselves. Bye now. I hung up the phone and let out another big sigh. Why do they believe they're not in the wrong, even after all this? I didn't understand what Paul was talking about earlier when he mentioned about our living expenses. The situation improved about a week after I left the house. My husband, who had come to check on me, apparently talked to Paul and Jean, and their text suddenly became more respectful and submissive. Wondering what had happened, I received a text from my husband.
Paul and Jean want to apologize. If you feel like it, please come home.
Thanks to my husband's talk, they finally seemed to understand. I replied to my husband's text, made preparations, and decided to go home that day. When I returned home, Paul and Jean were waiting at the entrance, their faces pale and worn out. It seems that they were quite upset by the lecture from my husband. I decided to hear the story about this past week from them and my husband.
About the living expenses I mentioned on the phone.
I said I didn't receive them, right? You said you wanted to save money, so I didn't say anything.
Actually, Dad was really mad at us about that.
It seems that my son had told his father about his contribution to the household expenses. It appeared that he believed I had been lying, and throughout he seemed to have painted me as the villain when speaking with his father. However, when his father explained that there was no way I could be splurging, as I was busy from morning to night with cleaning, shopping, preparing meals for 3 people, and doing the laundry while showing him our household book, he quieted down. You couldn't even believe me?
But Jean kept saying that she was giving you the money.
So what happened to your living expenses? I was using them. From my son's perspective, he was definitely paying the money, so he must have been baffled that the money was not reaching me. It seems that my husband and son confronted Jean and made her confess. At first, Jean was playing dumb, but when my husband started yelling at her, she finally confessed everything. I was shocked to hear this, as I had never seen my husband yell before. Apparently, Jean had been spending the money on dining out and going out with her colleagues from her part-time job. She had been going to fancy restaurants to show off and pocketing any leftover money for herself, she explained in a feeble voice. I'm appalled. She was accusing me of squandering money on the phone, but it turns out she was just talking about herself. But living with my in-laws can be stifling, and everyone was inviting me, so I just...
Just because of that, you thought it was okay to embezzle our living expenses. You made me look like a fool too.
What? You are acting all high and mighty too. At the point when the two of them began to stray from the topic and argue, my husband cleared his throat loudly. The two of them, seemingly terrified of my husband, jumped up in surprise and immediately became silent. I couldn't help but laugh at their behavior, like children who had been caught doing mischief.
Excuses, excuses. Cut the crap. First, you should sincerely apologize to your mom. Dad, I was also deceived by Jean. So, does that excuse your attitude towards your mother? Neither of you has apologized to her since she returned. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Finally, the two of them bowed their heads to me. Still, my son was making excuses, saying that he had been taking it easy because it was his home.
I've been getting busy at work, and I just wanted to relax at home. So what about your mother, who is being taken for granted and mocked by her big son and his wife even at her own home?
My husband's words cut through my son's excuses, leaving him speechless. I'm appalled at my son, who despite his age still relies on his parents, and at Jean, who took advantage of that to embezzle money.
Mom, I'm sorry. You see, I'm apologizing to you.
Do you think an apology makes everything okay? Please reflect on yourself a bit. The two of them thought that bowing their heads to me would resolve everything smoothly, and they were flustered by my words and tried to make excuses. But I could see through their scheme, and I shook my head. Whether you contribute to the living expenses or not, I can't overlook that attitude. You have to learn to be more grateful. But aren't you worried about your future too, mother-in-law? Yes, I'm full of worries about relying on people like you.
How can you talk to us like that?
You splurged our living expense out of stress from living with us. I can't have someone like you stay with us any longer. The two of them finally quieted down, realizing that I was not willing to listen anymore. They need to learn once again how rude their actions were while living together as a couple. Later, we managed to have them move out. In the days that followed, Jean, my son's wife, started to come to our house occasionally to learn household chores from me. She continually vented about how my son Paul did not lift a finger to help with any housework. As she had always been showing off to her colleagues, I assumed she couldn't complain to anyone else now. I now understand just how much I relied on you, Karen. Indeed. And yet, you had the audacity to accuse me of being deaf and squandering money. Being no longer able to live with us and having lost the pocket money she freely used before, plus having her part-time wages limited to make up for the money she previously misused, Jean fervently complained about her now austere life. But however I listened, all I could think was that she was just reaping what she had sown. As for Paul, he started to bring home delicious snacks as gifts from time to time, as if making up for his previous lack of consideration, which he still mentioned occasionally. I've always known he wasn't the most articulate and was primarily focused on work. Nevertheless, I was touched by the fact that he recognized my hard work during our discussions with Paul and Jean. Thanks for your hard work, honey. I appreciate it. I'm glad that I can talk to my husband like this again. I deeply feel the truth in the saying, after a storm comes a calm. Regardless of how it started, I'm now leading a life that is calmer and happier than before.